What if time doesn't move forward? What if, just beneath the surface of ordinary life, the past and the future are still breathing? There's something about old photographs, especially the unlabeled ones. A woman in a black coat stands half-turned on a busy street. She's holding something up to her ear, a moment captured in 1928. But today, it looks off, as if someone pressed rewind and record at the same time. We're taught that time is linear, a forward-moving arrow, each second falling behind us like discarded film reels. But what if that's only part of the story? Across the past 100 years, scattered voices have whispered another possibility, that time is porous, that in rare, forgotten moments it folds inward, that ordinary people, not scientists or astronauts, but soldiers, gardeners, commuters, repairmen, have slipped through. The accounts come from faded archives, lost notebooks, dusty police files. A man appears in Times Square in 1950, dressed in clothes last seen in 1876. A physicist receives a letter describing an experiment that erased a ship and its crew from space and time. Two British women wander through the gardens of Versailles and find themselves staring into the eyes of Marie Antoinette. These aren't just stories. In some cases, they're accompanied by physical artifacts, items that shouldn't exist. Photographs of the same man at two different ages, in the same frame. Machines found in shipwrecks that predict eclipses with the precision of NASA computers. Blueprints, manuals, voice recordings. Diaries that describe technologies not invented for another half-century. Of course, there are explanations. Hoaxes, coincidence, misremembered dreams. Our brains are storytellers, after all, filling in gaps, rearranging memories like a puzzle we've lost half the pieces to. And yet, what draws us to these stories isn't just the mystery, it's the strange familiarity they carry, the way they mirror something buried in each of us, a longing to revisit a moment we left behind, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, the future is already waiting for us. This isn't a series about proving time travel is real. It's about something deeper. It's about wonder. It's about the soft machinery behind the ticking clock, and the people who may have slipped between its gears. Over the next 14 parts, we'll trace the outlines of these encounters. From military experiments to medieval notebooks, from bustling city streets to ancient shipwrecks, we'll explore the cases that defy explanation. Not to declare them true, but to ask a different question. What kind of world would this be, if they were? So lean in, set aside what you think you know, and listen, not just to the facts, but to the silences between them. Because sometimes the past isn't behind us. Sometimes it's still calling. What if someone from the future logged on, not to change history, but to warn us? The year was 2000. The internet still felt new. Glowing screens in dark rooms, dial-up tones like mechanical whispers, forums filled with curiosity and code. Amid the chaos of Y2K fears and early meme culture, a username appeared, Time Travels/0. The posts were short at first, technical. A soldier from the year 2036, he said. He sent back to retrieve an old IBM 5100 computer, a forgotten machine that held the key to debugging critical systems in his time. The idea sounded absurd, until it didn't. He called himself John Titor. For 2 years he answered questions. He explained in chilling detail how time displacement worked, how gravity and rotation could be manipulated by singularities, how his time machine, a General Electric C204, was installed in a 1967 Corvette, later upgraded to a Suburban for cargo reasons. It all should have been nonsense, but he wasn't just spinning stories. He spoke like an engineer, clear, specific, unnervingly consistent. He knew about hidden functions in the IBM 5100 that only a handful of programmers had ever heard of. He described technical elements, cooling systems, micro-singularity containment that experts admitted would be difficult to fake. And his explanations of multiverse theory? More accurate than most physics textbooks at the time. Still, it wasn't the technology that gripped people. It was the predictions. He said there would be no weapons of mass destruction found in Iraq. He said CERN's experiments could create miniature black holes, 7 years before the collider confirmed it. He said we'd carry powerful computers in our pockets, that social media would fragment society, that Americans would trade freedom for security after a domestic terror attack, all this, before September 11, 2001. He warned of polarization, of surveillance, of cities splitting from their rural roots. He painted a version of the future that sounded unlikely then and uncomfortably familiar now. Some dismissed him as a hoaxer with lucky guesses, but others noticed the patterns. The way his posts didn't try to sell anything. The way he vanished quietly in March 2001, saying only, "There are a few safety checks I need to run before I leave this world line." And then, nothing. No follow-up, no merchandise, no fame. Just a ripple in the Internet's early waters, and a trail of ideas that seemed more real with each passing year. So who was he? A clever fiction writer? A physics prodigy playing a long game? Or, and here the question lingers, was he telling the truth? If John Titor was a hoax, it remains one of the most elaborate, intelligent, and eerie ever constructed. But if he wasn't, then he was something else entirely, a traveler from a parallel now. One close enough to resemble our own, yet different in ways we can only guess. He didn't promise salvation. He offered no utopia, just warnings, and the strange comfort of possibility. What if time travel doesn't come with a flash of light? What if it starts with a username, and a story that refuses to disappear? It began with a body. Not a mystery at first, just another tragic accident in New York City. June 1950, Times Square. A humid Thursday evening. The city was alive with neon and noise. Cabs rushed by. Pedestrians shuffled past flashing marquees and subway grates spewing warm air. And then, with no warning, a man appeared, in the middle of the street, and was struck by a taxi. He died instantly. It should have ended there. A sad footnote, a nameless casualty in the city's unrelenting flow. But when the coroner examined the body, the questions began. The man's name, according to his identification, was Rudolph Fentz. He carried $70 in old-style banknotes, crisp, as if fresh from printing. A copper beer token from a long-demolished saloon, a business card with an address that hadn't existed for decades. And his clothes, well, they belonged to another era, starched, buttoned, and unaged, a fashion more at home in 1876 than 1950. There were no modern documents, no license, no social security card, no explanation. Captain Hubert V. Rim of the Missing Persons Bureau took interest, and what he found next would shake him for the rest of his life. In the city's old archives, he discovered a case from 1876. A man named Rudolph Fentz, 29 years old, had vanished during an evening walk near Fifth Avenue. He had never been found. The description matched exactly, down to the eyes, the mustache, even the clothes. That might have been coincidence, until Ream found a photograph, sent by the missing man's son, still alive in the 1930s. The man in the photo was identical to the one who died in Times Square in 1950. Witnesses to the accident remembered Fentz stumbling into traffic, looking around in total disorientation, eyes wide, mouth moving silently, as if the lights, the cars, the very century itself had ambushed him. The case was buried. Too strange, too impossible. But those who saw the files, officers, coroners, reporters, never forgot. They spoke of it in hushed tones, as if even remembering it wrong might shift something. So what happened? Some say it was an elaborate hoax, that the entire story was fiction, repeated so often it became folklore. Others say the files were real, that they existed in police archives until they quietly vanished. But there's another theory, one that doesn't try to explain away the impossible. What if Rudolph Fentz didn't die out of time, but arrived that way? What if, on that quiet street in 1876, he stepped forward, not through magic or science or intention, but by accident? A slip, a fracture in time. And before he could understand where or when he was gone. No great experiment, no glowing machine, just one man, misplaced. His story haunts because it's so ordinary. There was no mission, no warning, just the quiet tragedy of being in the wrong place, a century too late. And maybe that's what time is. Not a line, but a tide. One that can pull people in without notice. How many others have stepped forward or back without anyone noticing? And if time can forget them, can we? What if the past isn't gone, just waiting for the right eyes to see it? August 10th, 1901. A warm afternoon in France. Two Englishwomen, Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, academics from Oxford, wandered the manicured grounds of Versailles. They weren't chasing ghosts. They weren't chasing anything. They were tourists, intellectuals, rational women walking through the famous gardens, a place soaked in history, but very much in the present. And yet something shifted. The air turned thick, heavy, as if the sun had dimmed behind something invisible. The birds stopped singing. The color seemed to drain from the world. And the silence, it wasn't empty. It was watching. Then the people appeared, men in strange green coats with powdered hair and tricornered hats, women in elaborate gowns, seated casually on the grass. A man in a dark cloak stood motionless on a path, watching them, warning them, without words, not to continue forward. One of the women sketching near the Petit Trianon turned slowly to look at them, her face pale, distant, her hairstyle unmistakably 18th century. Later, they would come to believe they had seen Marie Antoinette, not a statue, not a reenactor, but the woman herself. By the time they returned to their hotel, the spell had broken, but the memory had not. They were shaken, not by fear, but by the clarity of the experience. So they did what scholars do. They investigated. For 10 years, they studied maps, paintings, records. They interviewed locals, combed through documents, and each wrote down their memories, separately. What they discovered was more disturbing than the event itself. The paths they had taken no longer existed. The buildings they described had been torn down decades before. The people they saw matched historical figures, not just in appearance, but in placement, behavior, and detail. The sketching woman? Her precise location matched royal records of Marie Antoinette's daily habits in the summer of 1789. The French Revolution would erupt just weeks later. Their book, An Adventure, published in 1911, sparked outrage, fascination, and ridicule. Some believed them, many didn't. But none could explain how two educated women, without access to secret archives or psychic gifts, could so accurately describe a Versailles that no longer existed. Their accounts matched private documents locked in dusty French estates. Their descriptions of hairstyles, military uniforms, and garden layouts were more precise than any contemporary historians. And still they never claimed to understand what had happened. Was it a psychic vision? A shared hallucination? A wrinkle in time? They left the question open, because that was the point. They hadn't gone looking for history. It had found them. And perhaps that's what makes their story endure. Not because it was flashy, but because it was quiet. A walk in a garden, a shift in light, a face from the past looking back. If the walls of time are thin, What else have we missed? And if we do see the past, do we change it, or does it change us? What if an experiment in secrecy bent the fabric of time and couldn't be undone? It was the summer of 1955 when astronomer and UFO researcher Morris Jessup received a strange letter. The handwriting was erratic, the tone urgent. The author called himself Carlos Allende, or Carl Allen. But it wasn't his name that mattered. It was what he claimed to have seen. A ship, a war, and an accident that should not have been possible. According to Allen, the U.S. Navy had conducted a top-secret experiment in 1943 at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The goal was to render the USS Eldridge, a destroyer escort, invisible to radar using a powerful electromagnetic field. But the result, he said, was something else entirely. The ship didn't just disappear from radar. It vanished from view, blinking out of reality for minutes at a time before returning in a flash of green-blue light. When it reappeared, everything had changed. Most of all, the crew. Some were burned, others mad. A few were fused, physically embedded in the ship's steel bulkheads. Several disappeared entirely, and the rest began slipping through time. Allen claimed he met them later in bars around Philadelphia. Young sailors who would suddenly freeze mid-conversation, vanish for minutes, then return. Aged, shaken, sometimes bleeding, sometimes changed. One walked through a wall and never came back. Another aged 30 years in moments, dying of old age on the spot. The Navy, he said, had buried it. The ship was reassigned, records altered, witnesses scattered. But the trauma followed the crew, haunting them through time. Jessup, a serious academic, was disturbed. He shared the letters with contacts in the Navy, and in a strange twist, the Office of Naval Research responded, not with denial, but curiosity. Copies of his book were found in government archives, annotated in the margins with theories about time travel, teleportation, and magnetism, in handwriting matching Allen's. Then Jessup died, officially a suicide. But whispers followed. Was it guilt? Or had he seen too much? To this day, no official proof of the Philadelphia experiment exists. The Navy denies everything. Ship logs have gaps. Crew members disappeared or refused to speak. And yet, fragments remain. Eyewitness accounts, strange newspaper clippings from 1943, and medical records describing sailors suffering from something akin to temporal dislocation. Skeptics call it a myth, a Cold War-era tale born of paranoia. But others wonder, how did Allen, a simple merchant marine, describe principles of unified field theory and electromagnetic distortion that matched later scientific breakthroughs? How did he know? What if the experiment didn't fail, but succeeded in ways the Navy couldn't control? What if a ship did slip not just across space, but time? And what if those sailors are still slipping, caught in the undertow of something far beyond our understanding? If time is a sea, what happens when a ship sails off its edge? What if the future was hiding in plain sight, caught forever on film? The year is 1928. The place, Hollywood, man's Chinese theater, glittering beneath floodlights and camera flashes. Charlie Chaplin's new film, The Circus, is premiering. Crowds press in to glimpse the stars. Cameras roll, recording the glamour of a world still young with cinema. For decades, the footage lay dormant, a simple archival reel, stored and forgotten. Until 2010. A filmmaker named George Clark, combing through the black and white frames, noticed something strange. A woman, middle-aged, dressed in dark clothes and a hat, walks through the scene. But she's holding something to her ear, speaking, listening. Her mouth moves, her hand gestures. She is unmistakably having a conversation, and what she's holding looks uncannily like a cell phone. People in 1928 had never seen a portable phone. Radio transmitters were massive. Nothing handheld existed. Yet here she is, acting with perfect familiarity, as if making a call in the middle of the silent film era. Clark enhanced the footage, frame by frame, no editing, no signs of tampering. The film is real. And the object? Not a compact mirror, not a hearing aid, not a prop. It's the size, shape, and usage pattern of a smartphone. No one in the crowd seems to notice her. No one stares, points, or reacts, as if she isn't really there. Or as if she isn't there for them. Further anomalies emerged. Other people in the footage, at first glance dressed for the era, show small inconsistencies. Slightly modern fabrics, haircuts that didn't exist, mannerisms that feel off, as if they're mimicking 1920s culture without truly belonging to it. And the woman herself? Unidentified, not on guest lists, not mentioned in any studio logs, not a known extra or actor, no records, no history, just those few silent seconds. Theories flourished. Time traveler, dimensional slip, advanced tech test run. Some suggested she was using an early hearing device, but those were held differently and not spoken into. Others proposed an early walkie-talkie prototype, but those were bulky, required large antennas, and didn't work in that configuration. What's left is a simple, impossible image, a woman alone in a crowd, speaking into a device no one should have had, in a time that shouldn't have known it. Was she visiting? Was she lost? Or was she part of something else? Something larger, hidden in the folds of history. The footage endures, grainy, silent, but profoundly loud in its questions. If we can capture the past on film, can the future leave its fingerprints there too? And how many times have we seen it, without knowing what we were looking at? What if the future isn't waiting for us, but already knows we're coming? August 2006. Kalmar, Sweden. It started with something ordinary, a leaky pipe beneath a kitchen sink. Håkan Nordqvist, a man with no interest in science fiction, bent down to fix it, expecting rust, frustration, maybe a few hours of work. Instead, his hand slipped through empty space. Behind the sink, where there should have been wall and insulation, there was nothing, just a hollow. And then, a tunnel. Not dirt, not ductwork, something else. Smooth, warm, like walking through memory. He crawled forward, heart pounding, and when he emerged, he was still in his kitchen, but not the same one. The light was different, softer, bluer. The appliances were sleek, responsive, built into walls that shimmered faintly as if alive. Screens glowed, reacting to gestures. Music played without speakers. The air had a quiet, future hum. And there, sitting calmly in a low chair, was an old man, watching television. The man turned, and Håkan looked into his own eyes. A face older, yes, lined, weathered, but familiar in a way nothing else could be. It was himself, 40 years older. The meeting was not a shock, at least not to the elder Håkan. He explained that these slip points sometimes open, that the apartment had always been a place of strange energy, that over time he'd learned to live with it, sometimes expecting visits, sometimes receiving them. They talked, they laughed. The older Håkan showed him around. The world, he said, had changed, not in cataclysm, but in connection. Energy was cleaner, people lived longer, slower. He didn't offer lottery numbers or secrets, just tea, and a calm understanding that their meeting mattered in ways neither fully grasped. Before he left, the older man gave him something else, a tattoo. Simple, just his name and birth date, etched in a script that shimmered under the skin. The ink was painless, the process instant, and unlike any Håkan had ever seen. Then a photograph, A device appeared from nowhere, small, metallic. It captured their image instantly. Two versions of one man, side by side. Then the tunnel returned, and Håkan was back. In his 2006 kitchen. Same leak, same tools, same day, but now he had a tattoo and a photograph. Both still with him, both impossible. He told no one at first, but curiosity, or conscience, pulled him to share. He spoke to researchers. He showed the evidence. Experts studied the ink. It glowed under ultraviolet. It bore no scarring. Its chemical structure defied modern techniques. The font? Unidentified, as if borrowed from a language we hadn't designed yet. Facial recognition software confirmed it. The older man in the photo was him, aged correctly, proportionally, but not artificially. The details were too precise for digital editing, too human. Investigators tore open the wall behind his sink. Nothing. Concrete, solid, no passage, no breach. And yet, the tattoo remained. And so did the photograph. Skeptics scoff. Believers lean in. But Håkan remains quiet. He doesn't tour, doesn't profit. He returns to his job, to the dishes, to the kitchen where the past once met the future. What if time isn't a river, but a house, with rooms we haven't opened yet? And what if someone's already home? What if the future was once the past, and then forgotten? The year was 1901. Off the coast of Antikythera, a small Greek island floating in the Aegean Sea, sponge divers discovered a shipwreck. Wooden beams long rotted away, bronze statues corroded by salt, amphorae broken and buried beneath centuries of sediment. Among the debris was something else, something strange. A lump of bronze and wood, green with age, nearly dismissed as scrap. But inside that corrosion was a secret. Gears, wheels, teeth interlocked with impossible precision. It took decades to understand what had been found. And even now, over a century later, scientists are still struggling to explain it. They call it the Antikythera mechanism. Dated to around 100 BCE, it is a device unlike anything else from the ancient world. A complex analog computer designed to track celestial bodies with mathematical precision. It could predict eclipses, model planetary motion, follow the lunar cycle, and even calculate the timing of Olympic Games. The Greeks, we thought, weren't supposed to have this kind of technology. Differential gearing, the kind found inside the mechanism, wasn't reinvented until the 16th century. The precise astronomical math embedded in its functions? That wouldn't be rediscovered until Kepler and Newton. And yet, there it was. Hidden within that rusted shell were gears cut to a tolerance rivaling modern machine tools. Calculations of planetary orbits that accounted for irregularities unknown to science until thousands of years later. Approximations of irrational numbers buried in brass. The mechanism didn't evolve. It appeared, not as a prototype, not as a rough sketch of future potential. It was finished, functional, elegant, as if made by someone not experimenting, but remembering. Scholars searched for its maker. Some attributed it to Archimedes, others to lost engineers from Alexandria, but no other device from antiquity comes close. Nothing even resembles it. It is alone, a singular burst of brilliance or something else. Modern imaging has revealed more. Inscriptions too faint to read, planetary tracking systems previously missed, indications it was once part of a larger apparatus. But the trail goes cold. No manuals, no models, just this one device sitting in silence, challenging everything we thought we knew. Some wonder, was this an artifact of time travel? A relic left behind, deliberately or by accident, by someone who'd seen further than their era allowed. It's tempting. The evidence is maddening. The device is real. The knowledge it holds is out of time. And its disappearance from the historical record is as mysterious as its creation. If someone from the future walked among the Greeks, what else did they leave behind? That we've misnamed or misunderstood? Or maybe the more haunting question is this: what if we knew this once and forgot? The Antikythera mechanism is not a myth. It exists. You can visit it in a museum in Athens. Bronze gears whispering across millennia. A memory, perhaps, of a civilization. Or a visitor that understood time better than we do now. What if one of the greatest minds in history wasn't just ahead of his time, but out of it? He died in 1519 in a small room in France. By then, Leonardo da Vinci had already filled thousands of pages with inventions, observations, and visions of a world that did not yet exist. But when we read his notebooks today, something feels strange, beyond brilliance. A quiet impossibility echoes through the pages, because what he drew hadn't been invented yet, and wouldn't be for centuries. There, in his sketchbooks, a helicopter, its rotors coiled like a modern drone. A tank with sloped armor, gears, and transmission mechanics that mirror today's vehicles. A diving suit, a mechanical knight, bridges, submarines, calculators. A flying machine with aerodynamic control surfaces based on lift and drag. These weren't daydreams. They were engineering diagrams. Then there's the anatomy. Leonardo's human studies show a level of detail that seems surgical. He understood the circulatory system, described the heart's valves, the function of the brain's ventricles, all before medicine had names for these structures. His sketches of embryos, spines, and muscle fiber look like they came from MRI scans. But there were no MRIs, no microscopes, no tools to see what he somehow saw. And his astronomy? Leonardo noted the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, the tilt of Earth's axis, concepts that wouldn't be proven until Galileo, a century later. So how did he know? Skeptics say genius explains it, that Leonardo was simply the most curious, observant man of his time. And yet, scholars have noticed something odd. Many of his most advanced ideas appear suddenly, with no lead-up, no trial and error, no failed versions, just revelation. Even his handwriting shifts subtly in these sections, as if transcribing rather than creating. The math is advanced, sometimes centuries ahead. The concepts are whole, finished, like memories, not inventions. His designs even show components that wouldn't be physically possible to manufacture until the Industrial Revolution. Ball bearings, pistons, springs under tension, internal combustion principles drawn with eerie precision. And then there's what's missing. No record of him building the most advanced machines, as if he knew they wouldn't, or shouldn't, exist yet. Some researchers have suggested he was merely imagining what could be, but these aren't fantasies. They're blueprints, and some of them have been built today, and they work. So again, we ask, was Leonardo da Vinci simply a man far ahead of his time, or was he working with knowledge from beyond it? Was he a time traveler himself, or did he meet one? Or was he a kind of antenna, tuning into something outside the ordinary flow of time? Even in death, Leonardo seemed aware of the enigma he represented. He once wrote, "For once you have tasted flight, you will walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will long to return." A poetic metaphor or a memory? In his mirror-written notebooks, between anatomical drawings and siege machines, Leonardo left behind a kind of breadcrumb trail, one that doesn't lead forward but loops. Maybe time is less like a river and more like a spiral. And some people, like Leonardo, simply walk a few steps ahead or behind the rest of us. What if you could walk into a shop for coffee, and come out 50 years too early. Welcome to Bold Street, Liverpool, England. At first glance, it's nothing special, a pedestrian walkway lined with cafes, bookshops, and boutique stores. People hurry past under gray skies, glancing at their phones, huddling against the wind. Modern, ordinary. Except it isn't. Since the 1960s, something strange has been happening here. People report stepping into another time, not metaphorically, literally. In 1996, Frank and Carol Sayers were shopping. Frank entered a bookstore, as he'd done many times before. But when he stepped outside, everything had changed. The shop fronts were different. The air smelled of coal. The cars were vintage. The clothes, unfamiliar. Bold Street had become Bold Street in the 1960s. Frank wasn't alone. Other shoppers appeared equally disoriented. Some vanished. Some returned, shaken, seconds or minutes later, with memories they couldn't explain. Frank described stores that no longer existed, down to their window displays. His account matched historical records, precisely, even the placement of a signpost that had been removed decades earlier. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was 1996 again. Another case, 2008. A woman named Sarah Martinez steps into a boutique to try on a dress. But the interior is wrong. It's a department store from the 1970s, staffed by clerks in vintage uniforms. Shelves lined with items she hadn't seen since childhood. She tries to pay, but her credit card is refused. They don't know what it is. She leaves, confused. But when she looks back, the shop is gone. In its place, a trendy clothing store that's been there for years. The store she thought she entered no longer exists. These aren't isolated events. Over the decades, stories like this keep emerging. A man buys a newspaper dated 1967. A teenager sees horse-drawn carts rolling through modern streets. A woman hears swing music echoing from nowhere, and always Bold Street. Some dismiss it as urban folklore. Others look closer. Geological surveys show unusual magnetic anomalies beneath the area. Bold Street was built over a network of ancient tunnels, some dating back to the Roman era. Scientists have speculated that certain environmental conditions, humidity, barometric pressure, electromagnetic fluctuations, could trigger what some call temporal overlays. There's even CCTV footage. People caught on camera seem to pause, hesitate, or suddenly change direction, as if seeing something no one else can. Others appear to vanish for moments, then reappear in the same spot, dazed, blinking, confused. The locals have a name for it, the Liverpool time slips. Not everyone believes, but those who've experienced them don't forget. They describe a sense of thinning, as if time becomes fragile, see-through, as if past and present are layers of glass, and sometimes they align. Some say it only happens to sensitive people. Others believe there's a pattern, a rhythm to the street, a pulse that opens doors no one can see. And perhaps most unsettling of all, multiple people have reported stepping into the same past, the same shops, the same smells, the same music playing in the air. Is it memory? A hallucination? Or a real moment preserved in time, repeating itself like a skipping record? What if the past isn't gone, just tucked away, waiting for us to step into it by accident? And what if Bold Street is just one of many places where the veil wears thin? What if the future is already written, and some people dream in its language? His name was Edgar Cayce. Born in Kentucky in 1877, he was soft-spoken, religious, a farm boy who barely finished grade school. No scientist, no mystic. And yet, by the time he died in 1945, he had given over 14,000 documented readings, many of them recorded, transcribed, and archived. Most were medical, diagnoses he gave while in a trance, treatments involving herbs, diet, or energy fields he couldn't have known. But others were stranger. They were visions of the future. In 1935, Cayce described a world connected by a universal mind, where people would carry devices in their pockets that allowed instant communication across continents. He predicted that this technology would lead to isolation, addiction, and the erosion of deep connection. Smartphones, decades before they existed. He spoke of global networks of information used for education, commerce, and entertainment, and warned of their double-edged nature. He even described a time when the mind would be the primary medium of energy and influence. In 1928, long before DNA had been understood, Cayce spoke of the genetic code and how it could be used to prevent disease. He described hereditary disorders, gene therapy, and even stem cell regeneration using language unfamiliar to his own era, but strikingly accurate today. He predicted that humanity would explore space, not only reaching the moon, but building stations beyond Earth. He described the psychological strain of space travel, the effects of zero gravity, and even suggested that Mars had once supported life, all in the 1930s. But Cayce's most unsettling visions were not of the far future. They were of things that would happen soon. He predicted geopolitical shifts with eerie precision, changes in climate, the rise and fall of economies. He foresaw oil fields in locations no one had explored. He warned of rising seas, increased storms, and the emergence of new viruses. In many cases, the dates he gave, decades ahead, came true with uncanny accuracy. Skeptics dismissed him as lucky, a skilled guesser. But others noticed something else. When Cayce entered trance, his body would relax, his breathing slow, and then, in a voice not quite his own, he would begin to speak, as if reporting from somewhere else. He didn't predict the future. He remembered it. He described these visions not as symbolic or metaphorical, but as places he had visited, timelines he had seen. His recollections were full of sensory detail, smells, textures, tastes, as if he had walked the streets of futures that hadn't yet arrived. Medical tests conducted during his sessions revealed unusual brainwave patterns, not those of sleep or hypnosis, but something new. Gamma activity spiking in ways scientists couldn't explain, as if his consciousness had moved elsewhere. To Cayce, time was not a line, but a field. All moments, past and future, existed simultaneously. What he did, he said, was tune in, like a radio signal, like a memory half buried beneath the noise of everyday life. Today, his archives remain. His predictions continue to be studied, some still unfolding, others waiting. The scientific world remains divided. Was he a fraud, a visionary, or something even stranger? What if some people don't predict the future, but remember it the way the rest of us remember a dream we haven't dreamed yet? And if that's true, then maybe the future isn't out there at all. Maybe it's already inside us, waiting for us to recognize it. What if time travel leaves behind no footprints, only photographs? It's 1941, Canada, a bridge opening ceremony in British Columbia. The crowd leans forward in heavy coats, hats tipped against the light. Cameras flash. Everyone appears to belong, except one man. In a now famous black and white photo, he stands out like a dropped color frame in a monochrome film. You've seen it, or one like it. A young man standing near the crowd, wearing sunglasses and a zippered sweater that looks decades ahead of its time. A logo on his shirt that resembles modern branding. He holds something in his hands, a compact camera, possibly digital, not at all like the bulky, boxy models of the 1940s. He looks out of place, too relaxed, too modern. No one around him seems to notice. But in the photograph, his presence vibrates like a wrong note in an old song. Some call him the time-traveling hipster. The image spread across the internet, captivating skeptics and believers alike. Was it a prank, a manipulated photo, or something else? Experts analyze the picture. The negative is authentic, no signs of digital editing. The photograph comes from a museum archive, confirmed to be part of a series taken that day, every frame consistent. And still, there he is. Explanations were offered. Perhaps he was wearing modified ski goggles, or a hand-knitted sweater. Maybe the logo on his shirt was from a long-forgotten local team. But none of the explanations quite add up. The design, the materials, the stitching, the attitude, all just slightly off. As with so many stories in this series, it's not the photo itself that unsettles us. It's how possible it feels. Not because of technology, but because of behavior. He isn't trying to blend in. He's observing, curious, standing slightly apart, like someone who's traveled not just through miles, but through decades. And it's not the only image. Other photos have emerged. From film reels, archives, museums, people in crowds looking the wrong way, wearing the wrong thing, holding objects that defy their decade. Sometimes small things, a haircut, a wristwatch, a smirk that doesn't belong. Time travel, if it exists, would require discretion. But even the most careful visitor might be caught, not by the naked eye, but by a lens. A photograph is a kind of time travel in itself, a moment frozen, a sliver of the past preserved in silver halide or digital bits. And sometimes, what's caught in those frames doesn't match the era it claims to belong to. So we ask, are these images mistakes? Coincidences? Or evidence, quiet and patient, of travelers passing among us? People from the future, studying the past, standing in crowds that didn't see them, caught only because a shutter blinked at just the right moment. If time is a fabric, maybe some photos are places where the threads get tangled. And maybe, just maybe, we've seen time travelers already. We just didn't recognize them. What if time doesn't just move forward, but circles back when no one's watching? It happened quietly. August 2000s. A man renovating his home in Liverpool, England. Stripped wallpaper. Dust. A gap in the wall. At first, it seemed like a structural oddity, an alcove or disused crawlspace. But what he found was more than that. It was a street, a bustling one, alive with people dressed in clothing from the 1960s, old-style cars, shop signs with names long since vanished. The smells, coal smoke, tobacco, old paper, everything vivid, real. He stepped into it, stunned but certain, and then just as suddenly it was gone. What he'd discovered, or perhaps stumbled into, was something locals had long whispered about: the Liverpool time slips. Most frequently reported around Bold Street, the stories date back to the mid-20th century. They come not from paranormal investigators or fringe theorists, but from everyday people, shop clerks, retirees, students, all describing the same thing: a momentary fall through time. You're walking past a shop window, and suddenly it's no longer a bookstore, but a haberdashery from the 1950s. You reach to open a cafe door, and find yourself in a department store that closed decades ago. The people inside don't notice you, or they stare, puzzled. You blink, and it's over. One of the most famous cases involved Frank, a police officer in the late 1990s. While on Bold Street, his wife stopped to browse a bookstore. Frank walked ahead, then realized the street had changed. The pavement, the air, the sounds. He described cars and people from the 1960s. And then a van nearly hit him. As he jumped out of the way, the world snapped back to the present. He hadn't imagined it. He'd been there. And he wasn't alone. Multiple witnesses have experienced the same strange, dreamlike bleed-through. They describe the past as fully tangible, not ghostly or faded, but solid, as if time is layered. stacked. And every so often, the boundaries fail. CCTV footage has even captured people hesitating mid-step, turning, reaching toward things invisible to everyone else. Some vanish for seconds. Some reappear, stunned, as if waking from a sleepwalk. What causes it? Geologists have noted magnetic anomalies beneath the street. Ancient Roman tunnels lie beneath the pavement. Some theorists believe the combination of electromagnetic fields, weather conditions, and emotional energy might briefly fracture time's surface. But the truth remains unknown. Is this time travel in the physical sense, or a temporary overlap? A looped recording of reality replaying itself? And why here? Why this street, this city, this corner of England? Maybe it isn't just here. Maybe we've only noticed it here. Maybe the past echoes everywhere, in old houses, forgotten alleys, abandoned buildings. Maybe the veil is thinner than we think. And if so, what if the people in the past are seeing us too? Looking up from their newspapers, glancing over their shoulders, wondering who that strangely dressed stranger was, the one who looked out of place. Not a ghost, but a future they'll never know. What if we've never truly understood time? Because we've only lived it in one direction. All stories must end. But this one doesn't wrap itself neatly. There's no final proof, no machine to unveil, no traveler stepping from the shadows to confess. What we've seen across these 13 chapters isn't confirmation. It's something more elusive. A pattern. People from different countries, different centuries, different lives. And yet their stories hum with the same strange frequency. A man on a forum describing devices not yet built. A sailor who saw a ship disappear and never looked at the sea the same way again. A scholar who stepped into a palace garden and walked into the past. A photograph that captured someone who wasn't supposed to see there. A tunnel behind a kitchen wall that leads to a conversation with your future self. A machine rusted beneath the sea, bearing knowledge that should not have existed. And over again. Time not as a line, but a loop, a spiral, a place, a presence. We try to explain it. Science speaks of wormholes and quantum entanglement, of block universes and multiverse branches, of the observer effect, where the act of looking creates the reality we see. And yet, for all our formulas and theories, time remains personal, lived, felt, lost, sometimes remembered. Maybe these stories aren't about travelers at all. Maybe they're about us, about our instinct to hold on, to imagine we could return to a moment long past, or skip ahead to one we haven't yet earned. Maybe that's why these stories matter. Not because they prove time travel is real, but because they show us how deeply human the longing is. To know, to revisit, to understand, to feel, if only for a breath, that the past isn't dead and the future isn't sealed. We tell these stories because, deep down, we remember things that haven't happened yet. We feel nostalgia for times we've never lived. We dream of futures so vivid they leave us aching when we wake. And perhaps that's what time really is. Not a calendar, not a clock, but a kind of music. Something that flows through us, that bends around memory, love, loss, and hope. A current we sometimes fight, sometimes follow, and sometimes, just maybe, fall out of entirely. So where does that leave us? Maybe with a question. One more, before the end. What if the past is still happening? And the future is listening?